My beloved child, something shifted in the space between yesterday and today, and your soulmate was not prepared for what that shift revealed. It happened quietly. No dramatic announcement. No perfect timing. No carefully prepared speech. Just one unexpected moment that forced them to look at everything differently. And now there is something they need to tell you. Not eventually. Not when life becomes easier. Now. Because what happened has changed the meaning of the silence between you. Your soulmate recently came across something connected to you, something small enough that another person might have ignored it, yet powerful enough to stop them completely. For several seconds, they simply stared. Then an uncomfortable realization surfaced. They had misunderstood part of your story. Stay with this, because the surprising part is not what they discovered. It is what they finally understood about themselves. For a long time, your soulmate believed they still had time. Time to figure out their feelings. Time to choose the perfect words. Time to wait until circumstances became simpler. Time to approach you only when every uncertainty had disappeared. But this recent moment showed them something completely different. Waiting does not always create clarity. Sometimes clarity arrives only when you realize what waiting could cost. And that realization changed everything. They began replaying moments they once dismissed. A conversation that ended too quickly. A message they almost sent. A moment when they wanted to explain themselves but remained silent. Even one particular memory of you returned with such detail that they wondered why it had remained buried for so long. Here is where the story turns. They suddenly recognized that what they had been calling confusion was not confusion at all. It was hesitation. There is a difference. Confusion says, I do not know what I feel. Hesitation says, I know exactly what I feel, but I am afraid of what changes once I admit it. That distinction landed heavily. And from that moment, your soulmate could no longer pretend that everything between you belonged safely in the past. Something unfinished was still alive. Something honest. Something asking to be spoken. You might miss the turning point if you assume this is only about romance. It is deeper than that. Your soulmate has begun questioning the version of the future they were preparing to accept. A future where they simply continued forward, carrying unspoken words as though silence were easier. But now? That future suddenly feels incomplete. Picture someone standing in a room they believed they understood, only for a hidden door to appear in a wall they had passed 100 times. That is where they are emotionally. The door was always there. They simply could not see it until now. And what lies behind it concerns you. There is a sentence forming in their mind, a sentence they have rewritten more than once because the truth inside it feels bigger than the words available. They almost sent something. Then stopped. Not because they changed their mind. Because they realized the first message would not be enough. What they need to tell you cannot be reduced to a casual greeting. It involves a decision. A truth about why they pulled back. And one unexpected thing that happened recently which made them realize they may have been protecting the wrong future. Hold on to that thought. Because the next part begins with the exact moment they understood what they could lose, and the choice they made immediately afterward may be the first real sign that this story is finally moving forward. Then came the moment they could no longer explain away. Your soulmate was alone when it happened. Nothing around them looked unusual. Yet suddenly one detail from the recent past returned with absolute clarity, a detail they had overlooked when it first happened. Your name had been mentioned. Not casually. Not as part of an old story. Someone had asked your soulmate a simple question about you, and for reasons they did not understand at first, they could not answer immediately. They went quiet. Because the answer that rose inside them was far more honest than the one they had been giving everyone else. That silence exposed something. Your soulmate realized they had spent too much time describing your connection through circumstances instead of truth. They talked about timing, distance, responsibilities, uncertainty. Things that needed to be figured out. But underneath all of those explanations was one reality they could no longer avoid. You still mattered to them in a way they had never successfully replaced. And once they admitted that privately, everything began moving quickly. Here is the strange part. They did not immediately feel relief. They felt urgency. Because another realization followed almost instantly. What if you had already started believing their silence was the answer? What if you were slowly learning to build a future in which they no longer had a place? That possibility changed their entire emotional direction. For the first time, your soulmate stopped asking, "What happens if I speak?" and began asking a much more powerful question. What happens if I never do? That question stayed with them. During ordinary moments. While looking at their phone. While trying to focus on something completely unrelated. Even when they convinced themselves to leave the thought alone, it returned with greater precision. There was something they needed you to understand. Their distance was never the whole truth. Their hesitation was never proof that you meant less. And the recent event forced them to see how easily silence can create a story that neither person actually chose. Stay a little longer, because this is where their internal shift became a real decision. Your soulmate opened a conversation they had avoided for some time. This was not necessarily a conversation with you, not yet. It was with someone who knew enough to recognize when they were hiding behind careful words. And during that exchange, your soulmate finally admitted something they had never said so clearly before. I should have handled this differently. Those words changed the atmosphere. Because once spoken, they could not be taken back. Someone asked them what they intended to do now. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. Then they looked down at their phone. And this time, their hesitation felt different. Not fear. Preparation. As though they were finally choosing the words that could open the door they had kept closed. If this unfolding message is resonating with you, you can quietly share it, leave a comment with what stood out to you, or subscribe so you can continue this journey when the next chapter arrives. Now listen closely. Your soulmate is not planning to return with vague language. They know vague language created part of the problem. What they want to tell you involves accountability. It involves what they misunderstood. It involves what they now want. And most importantly, it involves something that happened very recently, something that made them realize the future they assumed was guaranteed could change without asking for their permission. That was the shock. Time had stopped feeling unlimited. Suddenly, they understood that opportunities can disappear while people are still deciding whether they are ready. And that is why this feels urgent now. But there is one more detail. Just when your soulmate had decided what needed to be said, they discovered that you may have unknowingly done something that influenced this entire change. You may not even realize what it was. Yet when they noticed it, their final excuse for remaining silent disappeared. And what they decided to do next was not what anyone around them expected. A strange certainty entered their mind the moment they noticed what you had done. It was not something dramatic. You had not made a grand announcement. You had not tried to get their attention. You had not chased an explanation. In fact, that was exactly what affected them. Somewhere along the way, your energy seemed to change. You appeared to be moving forward. Not coldly. Not with bitterness. Simply differently. And your soulmate noticed. Perhaps it was something you stopped doing. Perhaps it was the way you no longer reacted as predictably as before. Perhaps they sensed that your life was beginning to expand beyond the unanswered questions they had left behind. Whatever the exact detail was, it created one unsettling thought inside them. What if they are finally learning how to live without waiting for me? That question hit harder than they expected. Because until that moment, part of your soulmate had unconsciously believed the connection would remain exactly where they left it. Available. Unfinished. Waiting. But something had changed. You were no longer standing emotionally in the same place. And suddenly, the future they had been postponing began looking very real. Pause on that. Because this is where urgency became action. Your soulmate picked up their phone again. This time they did not immediately open your conversation. Instead, they went back through something older. A message. A photograph. A saved note. Perhaps even a small reminder connected to a moment between you that once seemed ordinary. But now they saw it differently. They noticed something in your words they had missed the first time. You had been more open than they remembered. More patient than they understood. More willing to meet them halfway. And a realization formed slowly. Maybe the distance between you was not created because the connection lacked something. Maybe it grew because both of you were protecting yourselves in different ways. That changed the entire story. Your soulmate had spent so much time imagining that they needed the perfect circumstances before approaching you. Now they understood something more mature. Perfect circumstances rarely arrive first. Honest conversations create better circumstances. And that thought moved them closer to a decision. They began mentally rehearsing what they would say. Not the polished version. The true version. I should have spoken sooner. I thought I needed more certainty. I didn't understand what my silence might make you believe. I need you to know what actually happened. But there is one sentence they still cannot practice without feeling everything change inside them. Because that sentence reveals what they truly want from you now. Wait until you hear why. Your soulmate is no longer thinking only about repairing the past. Their mind has shifted toward the future. They have started imagining what could happen if the two of you finally stopped communicating through assumptions and began speaking honestly. A conversation. Then another. A chance to understand what each person actually felt. No fantasy. No impossible promises. Just truth, clarity, and the possibility of building something more intentional than what existed before. And strangely, that possibility brought them peace. For the first time in a while, they stopped asking whether reaching out would make them vulnerable. Instead, they began seeing vulnerability as the only doorway left. Yet one obstacle remained. Your soulmate knew that when they finally spoke, you might ask the question they had been avoiding most. Why now? And they knew you deserved more than a convenient answer. So they searched themselves carefully. Was it loneliness? No. Was it fear of losing control? No. Was it simply nostalgia? That answer did not fit either. The truth was far more specific. Something recently happened that showed them a version of their life continuing exactly as it was, and instead of feeling safe, they felt an emptiness they could no longer ignore. That moment became the final proof. They did not merely miss you. They missed the possibility of what the two of you could become if both people finally showed up without hiding. And now your soulmate has made one quiet decision. They will not approach you pretending nothing happened. They will tell you what changed. They will tell you why the silence lasted. And they will finally reveal the one realization that made them understand why you kept returning to their thoughts even when they tried to move forward. But there is another twist ahead. Because shortly after making that decision, your soulmate received a piece of information they were never expecting, and it may completely change how this conversation begins. What reached them next was not a message from you, but it carried your presence all over it. A mutual connection mentioned something almost casually. Something about the way you had been handling your life lately. How you seemed calmer. More focused. Less willing to keep circling the same unanswered questions. Your soulmate listened without interrupting. At first, they tried to act unaffected. But inside, something shifted again. Because the picture being described was not of someone waiting helplessly for the past to return. It was the picture of someone becoming stronger. Someone rebuilding. Someone quietly choosing peace without needing permission from anybody. And that changed the meaning of everything your soulmate had been preparing to say. They suddenly understood that reaching out could no longer be about pulling you back into an old version of the connection. If they came toward you now, they would have to meet the person you were becoming. That realization humbled them. Stay close here, because this is where their planned conversation changed completely. The words they had rehearsed earlier began to feel inadequate. I miss you was true but too small. I've been thinking about you was also true but incomplete. Even, I made a mistake, did not fully explain what had happened inside them. Your soulmate realized the real message had to begin somewhere deeper. With recognition. They needed to acknowledge that while they were hesitating, you were growing. While they were analyzing every possible outcome, you were learning to move without certainty. And while they assumed there would always be another opportunity, you were becoming someone who no longer needed to wait for one. That was the moment they understood why the recent event had shaken them so deeply. It was never simply fear of losing you. It was the realization that love cannot remain meaningful if it is only felt privately. Eventually, truth has to become action. That thought changed their next move. Instead of writing something vague, your soulmate began forming a message with intention. Not a dramatic confession designed to overwhelm you. Something quieter. Something honest enough to create a doorway without demanding that you walk through it. They wanted you to have a choice. That matters. Because something inside them has matured. They no longer want to control the outcome. They want to tell the truth and allow the truth to stand on its own. If this chapter is speaking to something you have felt in your own life, you can share it with someone who might need the message, leave a comment with the line that stayed with you, and subscribe if you want to continue when the next turning point arrives. Now hear what happened after that. Your soulmate finally typed the opening line. Then erased it. Typed another. Erased that too. Not because they were retreating. Because suddenly they knew exactly what they did not want to do. They did not want to speak as if nothing had changed. They did not want to hide behind humor. And they did not want to make you responsible for easing their discomfort. So they began again. This time, the first words were simple. I owe you honesty. They stared at that sentence. And for the first time, it felt right. Because everything that followed could finally come from there. Why they pulled away. What they misunderstood. What happened recently. And why the thought of leaving all of this unsaid had suddenly become impossible. But then something even more unexpected occurred. Just as they were about to continue writing, they noticed a detail connected to the very beginning of your story together. A date. A place. A forgotten promise. Something that seemed meaningless at the time. Now it looked almost like a marker pointing straight toward this moment. Your soulmate froze. Because they realized the recent change had not begun days ago. It may have been building for far longer than either of you understood. And the next truth they are preparing to reveal is the one that could finally explain why this connection never felt completely finished. The forgotten promise was never really forgotten. Your soulmate had simply pushed it into a quiet corner of memory where unfinished things are kept. But now, seeing that old detail again brought back the exact atmosphere of that time. The words. The expression on your face. The feeling that something important had passed between you, even though neither of you fully understood how important it would become. And suddenly, your soulmate remembered what they had once implied. That when the time was right, they would tell you everything. At the time, it sounded like a sentence meant for later. Now later had arrived. That realization unsettled them in the best possible way. Because the recent event, your change in energy, and this forgotten promise were all pointing toward the same conclusion. Silence had reached its natural end. Your soulmate could either continue protecting themselves from an uncertain conversation, or finally become the person who could have it. And this time, they chose differently. But something else happened inside them first. They stopped imagining how you might react. For a long time, that had been their greatest obstacle. Would you be distant? Would you ask difficult questions? Would you even want to hear what they had to say? Those possibilities had kept them frozen. Now they understood they could not control any of them. The only part they could control was whether they approached you with truth. And strangely, surrendering the outcome made them feel stronger. What if this moment changes the entire path? Not because one conversation magically fixes everything. But because one honest conversation can stop two people from building futures based on assumptions. Your soulmate began seeing that clearly. They did not need to promise you a perfect tomorrow. They needed to tell you what was real today. And what was real was this. Something about you had remained present in their inner world despite every attempt to simplify the story. Not as an obsession. Not as a fantasy. As an unanswered truth. They had compared other connections, other conversations, even other versions of themselves to what they had experienced with you. And every comparison taught them the same thing. What existed between you had a quality they had never properly named. It made them feel seen. That was the part they had been afraid to admit. Because being truly seen changes a person. You had noticed things they tried to hide behind confidence. You understood pauses they thought nobody noticed. You recognized when their words and their feelings were moving in different directions. At first, that level of recognition felt comforting. Then frightening. So your soulmate did what many people do when something feels bigger than expected. They stepped back to understand it. Except distance did not reduce the feeling. It revealed it. And now they finally understand why. Wait for this next part. Your soulmate has realized that the message they need to give you is not primarily about returning to what existed before. They do not want the old connection back. They want the chance to create something more honest than the old connection ever was. Something with clearer words. clearer intentions. Less guessing. More courage. That is the future beginning to form in their mind. And for the first time, they are not picturing you as someone who simply fits into their existing life. They are asking what kind of person they would need to become to meet you properly in yours. That question has changed them. But just when they thought they understood the entire situation, one final piece surfaced. It involved the real reason they delayed speaking to you in the first place. A reason they had disguised even from themselves. And once they finally named it, your soulmate realized the hardest truth was not about you at all. It was about what loving you forced them to confront within themselves. There was one truth they had avoided because admitting it would change how they saw themselves. Your soulmate had not stepped back only because the timing felt complicated. It was not simply uncertainty. And it was never because the connection meant too little. It was because it meant enough to expose parts of them they had spent years learning how to keep hidden. That is what finally became clear. You represented something real. And real things demand a different kind of courage. Around you, your soulmate could not rely completely on appearances. They could not hide forever behind being busy, being practical, being careful, or pretending that everything was under control. You had a way of making them confront questions they preferred to postpone. What did they truly want? What kind of relationship were they actually ready to build? Could they receive the same honesty they claimed to desire? And perhaps the hardest question of all. Were they willing to be known without editing themselves first? That question stayed with them. Because somewhere deep inside, your soulmate had always believed they needed to become ready before deserving something meaningful. More settled. More certain. More accomplished. Less complicated. They kept imagining a future version of themselves who would finally know exactly what to say and exactly how to love. But the recent events shattered that illusion. They suddenly understood that people do not become ready by waiting for every fear to disappear. They become ready by deciding that fear will no longer make every decision. That realization was enormous. And it changed the message they wanted to send you once again. Now they were no longer preparing only to explain what happened. They wanted to tell you what they had learned. That their silence was partly a conversation with themselves. That stepping away had shown them what they valued. That losing certainty had forced them to discover what they were willing to choose. And that somehow, through all of it, your place in their thoughts had become clearer instead of smaller. Do not rush past this next detail. Because your soulmate began thinking about one specific moment when you had offered them understanding without demanding anything in return. At the time, they accepted it quietly. Now they see how rare it was. You gave them room without making them feel abandoned. You cared without trying to control. You listened beyond the words they were able to say. And only now are they beginning to understand what that meant. They had mistaken emotional safety for something that would always be available. But safety is not something another person owes us forever. It is something we learn to respect. That insight became the turning point. Your soulmate no longer wants to approach you expecting the same version of you they remember. They know you may have changed. They know you may have questions. They know trust cannot simply be requested because feelings remain. It has to be rebuilt through consistency. And surprisingly, they are not running from that thought anymore. They are considering it. Seriously. They have started imagining the first conversation differently. Not as a dramatic reunion. Not as an attempt to convince you. As two people meeting the truth at the same time. You may say things they need to hear. They may finally say things you once waited to hear. There could be pauses. Uncertainty. Even moments when neither of you knows exactly where the conversation is going. But for once, they are willing to enter that unknown without hiding. And then something happened that made the timing feel almost impossible to ignore. Your soulmate received confirmation about a decision they had been considering for their own future. A new direction. A change in routine. An opportunity that could reshape what the coming months look like. Normally, news like this would have made them think only about themselves. But their first thought was unexpectedly simple. I need to tell them. You. That was when they knew this was no passing emotion. Because when the future suddenly opened in front of them, your name appeared inside it. And what they are now considering doing with that new opportunity may reveal more than any confession could. A single decision about their future suddenly made your soulmate understand where you still belonged in it. The opportunity in front of them should have felt simple. It was the kind of change most people would celebrate without hesitation: a new direction, a fresh possibility, a chance to step into a different chapter. Yet the moment your soulmate imagined saying yes, something unexpected happened. Their mind went to you. Not because they needed your permission. Not because they wanted someone to make the decision for them. But because they realized there were certain things they no longer wanted you to hear about from a distance. That realization surprised them. For so long, they had convinced themselves that keeping parts of their life separate was easier. Safer. Cleaner. Now that separation felt strangely unnatural. And the question that rose inside them was impossible to ignore. If this changes my future, why does telling them feel like part of the decision? That was the moment another layer became clear. Your soulmate was not only missing your presence. They were missing the experience of sharing life with you. The ordinary things. The small victories. The unexpected turns. The moments when one sentence from you could completely change how they viewed a situation. Stay with this thought, because this is where their understanding moved beyond emotion. They began recognizing that meaningful connection is not proven only through intense feelings. Sometimes it is proven by who you instinctively want beside you when life starts changing. And when their own future shifted, their thoughts did not move toward the loudest person around them. They moved toward you. That truth stayed with them throughout the day. Your soulmate began imagining what it would feel like to finally tell you everything without controlling the response. They could almost hear the conversation. They pictured themselves saying that something had changed. That they had received news they were not expecting. That it made them reconsider where they were headed. And then they imagined saying the part they had been most afraid to admit. I realized I still think about you when something important happens. Even in their imagination, those words felt different. Because they were no longer about nostalgia. They were evidence. Evidence that you were still connected to the way they imagined their life unfolding. But wait. There was another realization hidden inside that sentence. Your soulmate began to understand that they had spent too much time trying to decide what your entire future together should look like before allowing one honest conversation to happen. They had been attempting to solve Chapter 10 while refusing to open Chapter 2. And suddenly, that seemed almost absurd. They did not need every answer. They needed one beginning. One truthful exchange. One opportunity to discover whether the connection could exist in the present, not only in memory. That thought brought a kind of calm they had not expected. For the first time, reaching out no longer felt like stepping backward. It felt like moving forward correctly. And this is where something extraordinary happened. Your soulmate started changing the way they planned to approach you. They no longer wanted to arrive carrying only explanations. They wanted to arrive with intention. There is a major difference. An explanation says, "Here is why I disappeared." Intention says, "Here is what I am prepared to do differently now." That became their focus. Consistency. Clarity. Honesty. No disappearing when emotions become uncomfortable. No leaving important questions unanswered simply because the answers require vulnerability. No pretending not to care when the truth says otherwise. Something in them had matured enough to understand that feelings without direction can keep two people trapped in the same story for years. They did not want that anymore. And then, just as they were beginning to feel certain about their next step, something from your shared past resurfaced in the most unexpected way. Not a memory this time. Not an old photograph. Actual words. Words connected to a conversation your soulmate once believed they understood completely. But hearing them again now revealed a second meaning. And hidden inside those words was the reason you may have known much earlier than they did that this connection was never meant to remain unfinished. The words sounded ordinary when they were first spoken, but now your soulmate could finally hear what was hidden underneath them. It was a conversation from long ago. One of those exchanges that seemed too small to become important. You had said something about timing. About not forcing what was not ready. About allowing people to discover truth in their own way. At the time, your soulmate assumed you were simply being understanding. Now they realized you had been saying something much deeper. You were giving them freedom. Not because you cared less. Because you understood that anything real had to be chosen freely. That realization stopped them cold. For months, perhaps longer, your soulmate had carried the idea that you were waiting for them to become someone specific. That you expected an answer. A promise. A decision. But listening to those old words again revealed something completely different. You had never asked them to become perfect. You had only hoped they would become honest. And suddenly the entire history between you looked different. Their pressure had not come from you. It had come from within themselves. They had been fighting expectations you never actually placed upon them. Can you see why this changes everything? Because once your soulmate understood that, one of their greatest fears disappeared. They no longer felt as though reaching out meant arriving with a complete map of the future. They simply needed to arrive truthfully. And for the first time, that seemed possible. Your soulmate sat with the realization for a while. Then another memory surfaced. A moment when you could have pushed harder. You could have demanded clarity. You could have forced an answer from someone who was not ready to give one. But you did not. You stepped back. And although they once interpreted that distance as the beginning of an ending, they now understand it differently. It may have been the greatest sign of respect you ever gave them. You allowed them to choose. The trouble was, they took too long to understand the value of that choice. Until now. Something has changed in the way your soulmate sees freedom. They once believed freedom meant keeping every option open. Never committing too quickly. Never allowing one path to become too important. But experience has taught them another definition. Freedom is also the ability to recognize what matters and choose it without being forced. That lesson hit them with surprising force. Because when they looked at their current life, they realized something uncomfortable. They had protected themselves from choosing so carefully that they nearly became trapped in indecision. And you? You had become the clearest example of what hesitation could cost. Not because you threatened to leave. Not because you gave an ultimatum. Because life kept moving. And your soulmate could finally see that you were moving with it. That was when their thoughts changed again. They no longer wanted to contact you simply because they were afraid of losing the connection. Fear was no longer enough. They wanted to reach you because they had finally discovered something they were willing to choose. You deserve to hear the distinction. I don't want to lose you, is one kind of statement. I understand why I want you in my life, is another. Your soulmate is moving toward the second. And that is far more powerful. They started writing again. This time the words came differently. Less polished. More human. They wrote that recent events had made them look honestly at themselves. They wrote that there were things they should have understood sooner. Then they typed a sentence that made them stop completely. I think I confused protecting myself with protecting us. They read it twice. Because there it was. The truth. Your soulmate had believed distance was preventing things from becoming complicated. Now they understood distance had created complications of its own. Misunderstandings. Assumptions. Unspoken questions. A connection living more in imagination than conversation. They did not want that anymore. And then came the detail they had not expected. While looking back through that old conversation, they found something else attached to it. A timestamp. A message sent shortly afterward. Words they had somehow forgotten receiving from someone who knew both sides of the situation better than they realized. Your soulmate opened it. Read the first line. And immediately understood that someone had seen the truth between you long before either of you was prepared to admit it. What that message revealed would become the final piece your soulmate needed before deciding whether to press send. For a few seconds, your soulmate could not believe that message had been sitting there all this time. It was from someone who had quietly observed the connection between you long before either of you knew what to call it. The message was simple. Almost too simple. It said that your soulmate was not confused about you. They were overwhelmed by what the connection was asking them to become. That sentence landed differently now. Back then, your soulmate had dismissed it. They told themselves the person was reading too much into things. They believed the situation was more complicated than that. But after everything that had happened recently, those old words suddenly felt precise. Almost uncomfortable in their accuracy. Because that was exactly what had happened. You had not simply awakened emotion in them. You had awakened responsibility. The responsibility to communicate clearly. To stop hiding behind uncertainty. To decide whether they wanted a connection they could control or one that could actually transform them. And your soulmate had not been ready for that distinction. Until now. Here is where the entire story takes another turn. The old message contained a second line your soulmate had completely forgotten. It said, "One day, something will happen that makes you realize silence is also a decision." Your soulmate read that sentence again. Then once more. And suddenly, the recent event that started all of this felt different. They understood why it had affected them so deeply. The event itself was not the entire reason they changed. It was the trigger. It forced them to recognize that every day they remained silent, they were still choosing something. They were choosing distance. Choosing uncertainty. Choosing the possibility that you might build a future based on incomplete information. Your soulmate finally understood that doing nothing was not neutral. That realization changed the weight of the phone in their hand. For the first time, sending the message no longer felt like creating a new situation. It felt like finally responding to one that had existed for far too long. And then something remarkable happened inside them. The fear did not disappear. But it stopped being the loudest voice. Clarity became louder. Your soulmate began reading everything they had written. The explanations. The apologies. The careful sentences. And then they deleted nearly all of it. Not because those words were false. Because suddenly they understood that the truth did not need to arrive as a speech. It needed to arrive as an opening. They started again. A few honest lines. No dramatic promises. No pressure. No attempt to predict how you would respond. Just something real enough to finally break the pattern. But then their thumb stopped above the screen. One final question entered their mind. What if you had changed so much that hearing from them now would mean something entirely different than it once would have? Oddly, that thought did not make them retreat. It made them more respectful. Your soulmate realized that whatever happens next, they cannot approach the present version of you using assumptions from the past. They will have to listen. That may be the biggest change of all. They are no longer preparing only to be understood. They are preparing to understand you. What happened while they were distant? What did you learn? What did their silence make you feel? What do you want now, not what they hope you still want? Those questions are beginning to matter as much as their confession. And this is why the conversation they need to have with you feels so urgent. Not because some invisible clock is counting down. Because your soulmate finally recognizes that truth becomes less useful when people postpone it indefinitely. There is something they want you to know while it can still be spoken honestly. Something about the choice they made. Something about the future opportunity now sitting in front of them. And something about why, when that future suddenly became real, you were the first person they wanted to bring into it. But the message was still not sent. Because just as they reached the final line, your soulmate received another notification. They looked at the screen. And what appeared there made them realize this story was no longer moving only inside their mind. Something in the outside world had started moving too. The notification carried only a few words, but they changed the direction of everything. Your soulmate stared at the screen. For a moment, the room around them seemed to disappear. Because the message was connected to the opportunity they had recently been considering, the same opportunity that had already made them question what kind of future they truly wanted. Only now there was a deadline attached to it. A decision could no longer be postponed indefinitely. And strangely, the first emotion your soulmate felt was not excitement. It was clarity. They suddenly understood that the next chapter of their life was beginning, whether they felt completely prepared or not. That realization brought you back into focus with almost startling force. What if the real reason they had been struggling to speak was not that they lacked words? What if they had been waiting for life to stop changing long enough for them to feel safe? But life was not stopping. It was accelerating. And your soulmate finally saw the problem. If they continued waiting for perfect timing, they could spend years standing beside doors they were too cautious to open. That thought changed something fundamental inside them. They looked again at the unfinished message meant for you. This time, they did not see a risky conversation. They saw an opportunity to stop living indirectly. To stop letting assumptions carry messages that should have been spoken aloud. To stop asking the future to make decisions they were capable of making today. Stay with this moment, because something subtle happened next. Your soulmate imagined accepting this new opportunity without ever telling you what they truly felt. They pictured the weeks moving forward. Different routines. Different surroundings. New responsibilities. A completely changed landscape. From the outside, everything looked successful. But inside that imagined future, there was still one unanswered question. What would have happened if they had simply been honest with you? That question was enough. Your soulmate realized they did not want to carry it into another chapter. Not as regret. Not as unfinished curiosity. Not as another story beginning with, "I almost told them." So they changed the final line of the message. The earlier version had tried to protect them. It was polite. Careful. Easy to retreat from. The new version was different. It made room for truth without demanding anything from you. It acknowledged that time had passed. It acknowledged that you might not be standing where you once stood. And then it said what your soulmate had avoided saying directly. I don't know what this becomes, but I know I don't want silence deciding it for us. They stopped. Read it. And something inside them became quiet. Not because they knew your answer. Because for the first time, they knew their own. That is the transformation happening here. Your soulmate is no longer searching desperately for certainty about the outcome. They are becoming certain about the kind of person they want to be inside the outcome. Honest. Present. Willing to listen. Willing to accept whatever truth comes back. And that changes everything. But there was still one final obstacle. Their finger hovered over the message. They could send it. Right there. Right then. Yet your soulmate remembered something about you, a detail connected to the way you handle serious conversations. Something you once told them. Something they had ignored at the time but suddenly understood now. And instead of pressing send immediately, they made a different choice. A more personal one. Because they realized some truths should not arrive as text on a screen. Some truths deserve a voice. And what your soulmate decided to do next was the first move in this entire story that could no longer be mistaken for hesitation. This time, your soulmate did not type another word. They closed the message. Not because they were backing away. Because something inside them had finally become too real for a screen. They remembered something you once said during a serious conversation, something they barely understood at the time. You had told them that some truths lose their meaning when they are hidden behind perfectly chosen words. Back then, your soulmate thought you were simply talking about communication. Now they understood. You were talking about presence. About hearing hesitation in someone's voice. About knowing when a pause means more than a sentence. About allowing a real conversation to breathe instead of turning it into something polished and untouchable. And suddenly, the message they had spent so long writing felt incomplete. Your soulmate did not want you reading their truth alone and wondering which parts were sincere. They wanted you to hear it. That decision created a completely different kind of nervousness. Because writing had given them control. They could delete, rewrite, rearrange, hide behind better wording. A voice would give them nowhere to escape. And strangely, that was exactly why they chose it. They opened your contact. For several seconds, they simply looked at your name. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of imagining what they wanted from you, your soulmate began imagining what you might need from them. Clarity. No games. No half-statements. No emotional puzzle for you to solve. Just the truth. That shift changed their entire approach. They no longer wanted the conversation to begin with, "Do you still feel the same?" They realized that question would quietly place all the emotional weight on you. So they replaced it with something far more accountable. "I need to tell you what changed in me. Feel the difference." One sentence asks you to prove something. The other takes responsibility. And that is the version of your soulmate now standing at the edge of this conversation. But there is more. They started thinking about the future opportunity again. The deadline. The change coming toward them. The possibility that their everyday life could look completely different soon. And finally, they understood why telling you mattered before making that decision. Not because your answer should determine their entire life. Because they did not want to make another major choice while pretending you had no place in their emotional truth.